Ending like talk radio.
Hello and welcome to episode 45 of the Clacks Women for Independence podcast. We didn't have an episode last week because I was away, but what an eventful week we had, so we'll be touching on some of the themes from last week in the podcast today. Just to start us off in the right mood, this week's music is called Fire and Thunder and it's copyright-free music from CJ Beards. And thunder and lightning on Tuesday night last week. Wow, I have never seen lightning like that. It was more like those continental electrical storms that you see. It was just incessant. And we woke up the next day after not very much sleep to find that we had a brand new river running right the way through the middle of our cycle track. And fields everywhere, as far as the eye could see, had turned into lakes. A salutary reminder that the climate emergency hasn't gone away. We're also seeing the COVID-19 starting to flare up again, particularly with the Aberdeen outbreak, and also a little flare up in the Orkneys. Now, I would hesitate to say that that's because of Bozo the Clown's recent visit there. I don't think he met enough people outside of the soup factory to infect anyone this time, but it hasn't gone away, and again, a consequence of the weather was that awful train derailment at Stonehaven, which luckily only had 12 people on board. Could have been an awful lot worse. And then the exam results. Well, what a feeding frenzy there was amongst opposition parties at Holyrood this week. They manufactured a vote of no confidence against the Education Secretary, John Swinney, and there was then 15 minutes of a debate which was awful to listen to. It was just awful. Labour, Tories and Lib Dems, all the UK parties squatting in Holyrood, lined up to take potshots at John Swinney. I'm not going to dignify any of their contributions with repeating them, but there were two standout speeches, I thought, during the debate. The first from Ross Creer of the Greens, and the second from my favourite, Mike Russell. So just going to have a listen to those.
I call on Ross Creer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm sure we could have all foreseen the points broadly made by Richard Leonard and Ruth Davidson in opening, and I have prepared some remarks in response to that line of argument. But before we get to that, though, I'm not planning on any big build-up to a point everyone is well aware of. The Greens will, of course, oppose this motion. And before I get to the partisan manoeuvres defining this debate, I want to explain why. I spent 4 months warning that a system was being designed which would not only treat young people like data points than individual learners, but one which was fundamentally unjust to working-class young people and to those in our most deprived communities in particular. I challenged the Education Secretary and the SQA in Parliament, as did Patrick Harvey. I lodged Freedom of Information requests and wrote to the Equalities and Human Rights Commissioner once her office became involved. My team and I published our own analysis of the schools most likely to be disadvantaged by the system. We were certainly not the only ones to raise these concerns. Ian Gray did an excellent job of raising them as well. But in Parliament, we have consistently been leading on this issue, just as we have on the fundamentally broken nature of the assessment system in Scotland and the organisational culture of the SQA. When the results arrived last week, we took no pleasure in being vindicated. I'm sure I wasn't the only one who spent Monday evening dearly wishing that I would be proven dramatically wrong the next morning. But none of us were. For days, my inbox was flooded with stories from pupils, parents, and particularly from teachers, heartbroken and outraged over what had happened. I hope we were all inspired to witness the revolt of thousands of young people and their supporters who took to the streets, launched petitions, spoke to the media and lobbied all of us to have this undone. Without their resistance, I don't think we would have seen the reversal announced on Tuesday. In one particular letter that I received, which was also sent to the Education Secretary, a parent told me how their child had been presented with an award for maths by none other than John Swinney himself, had achieved over 90% in their National 5 and Highers, and was clearly on track to an A at Advanced Higher, but was devastated to be given a D by the SQA. The moderation system was fundamentally designed to maintain the apparent credibility of grades at an aggregate national level. It was not designed, regardless of the intentions of its designers, to award each individual young person the grades that they deserved. And for that reason alone, it should never, ever have been put into operation. But it was, and last week we saw the results. The question was, what were we as Parliament going to do about them? Labour's initial response was visceral, but ultimately vague condemnation, leading the Daily Record's political editors to suggest that it was the Greens leading the opposition to this rather than the Labour Party. And what power Paul Hutchin turns out to have over the Labour Party. As an almost immediate response to his comments, Labour dropped the nuclear option, the motion of no confidence. From that moment, every opposition party had the same choice: negotiate a solution with the government or simply gun for the Education Secretary. Any one party could have secured a fix for 75,000 young people in exchange for their support. But of course, only the Greens were interested in actually fixing the problem. Others simply saw a political opportunity, one that, given today's events elsewhere in the UK, takes on a particularly hypocritical tone. Our MSPs agreed that we would support the motion of no confidence unless the government agreed to implement our proposed solutions immediately. Those solutions were the restoration of all 124,000 downgraded results to the level estimated by teachers, the preservation of 9,000 upgraded results, given it would be a bit perverse to penalise those young people a week later, an independent review into how this happened despite months of warnings, which will consider the issues raised around transparency and scrutiny, and a second longer-term review of the exams and assessment system in Scotland. As everyone is now aware, the government chose to deliver on those demands. The Greens' only priority here was restoring the grades of 75,000 young people who had been treated so unjustly. That is what was achieved. So I find it pretty entertaining that the Tories in particular are squealing in outrage once again at a terrible error made by the Scottish Government, but as always ducking the issue of their own party doing the same thing on a measurably worse scale in this country's other government. To be calling for John Swinney's resignation, but apparently have full confidence in the disgraced former Defence Secretary Gavin Williamson, really does take some brass neck. The stories from England, Wales and Northern Ireland are just as heartbreaking as those we saw here. I'm rounding off, but if there's time on hand, Presiding Officer. Yes.
Davison. Ross Greer.
I hope I get my time back in hand, Presiding Officer. Ruth Davidson is trying to give some kind of impression that Gavin Williamson saw the problem that was coming and acted to fix it. No, he did not. Gavin Williamson was making statements to the press saying any attempt to fix this would somehow give young people grades they didn't actually deserve. What has come about in England today is demonstrably worse. It is the same error in principle, but measurably, proportionately, quantifiably worse than what has happened in Scotland. No government in the UK is free from blame in this entirely foreseeable and avoidable debacle. The difference so far in Scotland is not only did the Greens use our position to make sure the problem was fixed, but the First Minister and the Education Secretary have both held up their hands and apologised. That doesn't undo the damage. They have a long way to go before that's the case. But if there's one thing that I can't stand in politics, it's hypocrisy. And looking around at the two-faced positions of other parties in this Parliament today, I see more of that than I do a sincere interest in the best interests of our young people. And the Greens will have nothing to do with it.
Thank you. I'm now calling Michael Russell to close for the Scottish Government. Michael Russell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As Jamie Green has just said, motions of no confidence are mercifully very rare parliamentary occasions. They shouldn't be the occasion for random smears, political posturing and paying off old scores, which regrettably has been the norm this afternoon. But instead they should be a careful and clinical examination by means of a very tightly but very clear set of objectives about a central issue: if and when a minister deserves to lose the confidence of his parliamentary colleagues and be removed from office. Now, Presiding Officer, I made exactly the same point 20 years ago when I moved the very first motion of no confidence in this chamber. You were there, and I apologise to those people who were there who are going to hear the same arguments again. Because to arrive at those tests, we need to look at parliamentary experience elsewhere. And although the parties here are not willing to think about what's happening at Westminster today, I am. And despite belief that doing the honourable thing is a long tradition, in fact, there were no such ministerial resignations at all at Westminster between 1917 and 1954. And it was then that the famous Critchell Down case established for the modern age, if the members listen, they will learn something. Some of the circumstances in which a minister should take the ultimate responsibility and either resign or be removed. And in December 2000, in the very first debate, I suggested 3 tests that needed to be applied. First, did the minister fail to act at key times? And I called that the Carrington test, because it was the reason Lord Carrington resigned as Foreign Secretary at the start of the Falklands campaign in 1982. Secondly, was the policy which the minister was pursuing flawed because of the minister? And I called this wait and get the answers, don't guess the results. I called this the Howard test, after the former Tory leader, Michael Howard, who failed to resign despite a debacle over prison escapes. And thirdly, was the minister culpable, but was he or she already out of the way and liable not to cause any more harm? Think of that as the Mandelson test. I'm sure Labour remembers that their Minister Mandelson resigned twice in 8 months. And today we could add a 4th test. When a minister discovers that there's a serious problem, does he or she act swiftly to resolve that problem, taking full responsibility as a minister should, ensuring that at the earliest opportunity they apologise and institute the necessary action? I'm calling that the Swinney test, because he did just that. John Swinney doesn't fail the Carrington test because he acted as soon as he could. He doesn't fail the Howard test because the methodology the SQA used in the way it was agreed was not effective. No. And he does, no indeed, nor does he fail the Mandelson test. He's there and working. And he does not fail his own test, the Swinney test. He did the thing I would always have expected from a man of integrity. He took responsibility and then he took action to make a difference to those affected. So on any objective measurement, applying any objective tests, he has no case to answer. We could, however, apply some other tests, particularly to those who have been baying for his blood this afternoon. We could try the Lamont Grey test. Is the proposer of the motion blinded by bitterness at their own political failures? Yes. Oh, well, sorry, 2 ex-Labour leaders. There's a lot of them about. The Davidson test, the Green test, is the political ambition so great they don't care about the damage they are doing to either the system or the individuals. Or the Rennie test is the position adopted just in an attempt to get noticed. Anyone who votes for this motion tonight is failing those tests. Presiding Officer, John Swinney has shown himself to be much, much bigger than his accusers. The pupils and the families affected, the really important people, have already shown their appreciation of what he has done. And I hope this chamber is listening to them and not to his discreditable and discredited accusers today. And in doing so, this chamber should apply one final test. I'll call it the Glover test, after the Church of Scotland minister in Perthshire who tweeted it on Tuesday night. These are his words. I want John Swinney to stay. Otherwise, it's a culture where if you lie and deny, you can stay. But if you admit and address, you must go. I would ask this chamber to rise above the noise and unpleasantness of this afternoon. Let's do what I think Scotland wants and apply the Glover test. Let's not accept that Scotland's a country that prefers lying and denying to admitting and addressing. Let's aspire to something better than bitterness and bile. This week, John Swinney, for the sake of 75,000 young people, admitted and addressed. That is precisely what we should want from our leaders. And that is what this leader did. And that is what this Parliament should ringingly endorse today.
And as we speak, the exam fiasco in England and Wales rumbles on, and 40% of English students have been denied the markings that they expected. But the hallmark of this Westminster administration is lie and deny, so I'm not expecting anything to change there, but we'll see. Right, now we're going to pay a visit to the virtual coffee shop. If you heard our last podcast, you'll know that we'd actually ventured out to meet up in a park last time, but this time we've gone back to the virtual coffee shop because this is also the week that the school kids have gone back, and a couple of our group are parents, so they didn't want to take any chances. So, of course, we agreed to have another shot of the virtual cafes. And here's some of the topics that came up this week.
Is Robin back to school this week? How's he liking it?
Yeah, he's back to school. Chaos has reduced a little bit. Not much, but a little.
Was he happy enough to go? Was he worried about it?
He wasn't really worried about it. He just doesn't like school. Full stop. He's not a fan of school. He would love to go to school if it was just breaks.
No, yeah, well.
Wouldn't we all? You keep hearing about them. Oh, are you looking forward to going back to school? I can't wait. I can't. What planet are you on? School's bloody torture.
Yeah. Robin's answer is normally nah.
Yeah.
Related to school, it's meh.
I used to laugh when I would ask the kids things, and it was kind of like a what they were trying to say, whatever, but all you got was the signal that they were saying whatever, or you get the I don't know, but it wasn't even I don't know. It was. I once asked this is when I was teaching, and I can't remember what book we were reading, and it was P7s I had, the sentence had in it, and then she shrugged at the comment, and I said to one wee girl, what does shrugged mean? And she went, don't know. That was absolutely brilliant, and she looked at me perplexed, and I was like, you just shrugged there. Oh dear. But yeah, but it's been interesting. I was listening to Radio 4 yesterday, and they were saying, there's all these concerns about kids going back to schools and what's potentially going to happen with the outbreaks, and whether it's the kids carrying it and transmitting it on or whatever. So they were looking at Sweden, where they've never stopped going to school.
All right.
And seeing what happened there, and just saying there was no greater incidents through schools because of the measures they put in place about, you get any symptoms, you must immediately report them and not come to school and all this kind of stuff. So they haven't seen any greater incidents in either the young people, their families, or the staff.
I think there is some quite strong evidence, though, that the younger kids are less transmittable. It's that, not that. It's the teens and early 20s are actually they're more transmittable. Getting people together, it's going to spread. Whatever, yeah, put your masks on, do all these other things. It's going to spread.
But they're not wearing masks in Swedish schools. The kids and the teachers are not wearing masks.
They're not wearing masks here, are they?
What of your kids? Are they back? Are they all right?
Yeah, they're back. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, fine.
Yeah, they're back. Of course, you only see kind of the reaction of your kids. You don't really see the first day round was the one that had a complete wobble at the gate. And she'd actually been really, really good at managing her own anxieties. You could tell she's anxious, but she put so much preparation into place that it was like she was self-regulating with that. But it was the last bit. And then it was everybody else had gone inside, and then the headmistress came down because she could see that Round was struggling, and just kind of said to her, look, well, how about we just try an hour today? If you're really struggling, then we'll just speak to Mum and see if she can come and get you before that. So we did that, and obviously she settled within, very quickly, and was thrilled to see her pals again. it was the next day that Rush was just, he wouldn't leave the house. He was just saying he felt completely unsafe. Even though he'd had a great day the day before and was able to tell us about all the things that they'd done. We managed to get him in at 11 o'clock after doing some play therapy stuff with him. And then I got him at lunchtime. And again, he had settled as well. He'd had a great time at PE, landed on his butt. They've both gone off absolutely fine today. You could see they were really, really overwhelmed with it. And we've had great communication with the teachers and with the headmistress. And they kind of want to say, don't feel alone in this. It is really hard for them. And they've just been really understanding with the kids and understanding that it is very, very different with everybody. We have noticed that on Dojo, which for those of you who don't know is the kind of messaging system that parents can have with schools and directly with the teachers. There have been memos sent out, I think, each day to say to parents, please can you remember that you're not allowed beyond this point, and can you please make sure that you're keeping your 2 meters distance. There's only so much they can do with the kids, and they've got their ways of managing with the kids, but actually if the adults aren't going to observe it. And I felt terrible on Wednesday when Brown was struggling because she had a bike and when the head came down, she had her face mask on, but I hadn't been quick enough to get mine out of my pocket. And so I was like going, oh, geez, don't, no, you're going to go and stay there. That's what it's been like for us.
Depends on what information the kids have been given beforehand and how much their parents, as a friend who's got a wee one who's just gone into P2, basically hasn't explained anything about the virus to her wee one. Said she didn't want her worried about it. You're balancing that against, well, but if they don't know anything about it, how are they going to understand all the changes that have been put in place? It's just like, oh, it's just changed for the sake of it, has it? They've all taken different tacks to how they've parented through this. So, and then you imagine the staff are dealing with this whole range of kids that have been told different things or had different explanations of why we're now doing what we're doing. Harry's nursery teacher she kind of called me aside and said, they were playing in the nursery today and Harry didn't know what an iron was. And I'm like, yeah, he's probably not seen one out very often in our house.
Unusual. I don't know what an iron is.
Yeah, life is too short for ironing. Although I do appreciate for some people it is actually quite a therapeutic activity.
I've heard that.
The definition of needs help, ironing your pants.
Somebody posted up on Facebook that the kids had been put in circles, lining up to go into school, and I think it was age rate. So they had to social distance the minute they got into the playground, and no parents were allowed in the playground. It must be down to the school to what extreme they put the social distancing in, because I know that St Bernadette's aren't doing that. They're taking each class, I dare say because it's a smaller school, they're taking each class and keeping that as a bubble. So the teachers have got the mask on and the visor, but the kids can mingle with anybody else in the class. So, and I'm presuming that's all the way down to the lower schools. I've only been into school once because Robin's quite independent and can get to and from school on his own. And I don't really want to go anywhere near the school with lots of people.
Was that not the thing, though? Kids in primary didn't have to observe anything. It was only secondary and above. Is that right?
I don't know. I think this was a primary school that they had circles on the ground. I quickly just briefly looked at the article that somebody posted, and they had a picture of all these kids standing in circles and then getting called to come into the classroom. And I was like,
you can imagine how there might be sort of, here are the basic guidelines you've got to try and achieve. But then given that every school estate could be different, it might be that they have to apply them to their own circumstance.
See, when I taught at mainstream, my first class, I had 33 primary ones. There's no way the size of the classroom, even though they were wee people, that you could get the sort of social distancing space. I know they're saying you don't need it for those wee ones anyway, but just as you say, the school estates are all very different, and some will have lots of space. Some will be able to, go outdoors and do lots of teaching outdoors. Others don't have a bit of grass in their playgrounds.
I'm desperately wanting to get back to the pool. I miss that much more than going to the gym. Quite happy not to go to the gym.
I'm not suggesting this for you, but my friend's been on at me for a while to get a wetsuit because she does paddle boarding.
Oh, right.
And she also wants to get into wild swimming. I do have another friend who's a wild swimmer. So just this morning I have managed to get one on eBay. But that will be me just getting in the water. That will be on my attempt to keep warm. Is suddenly dance like I'm in the 80s again. And
Are you going to start in the Devon? We'll all come down and cheer.
Well, the state it's in just now. Yes.
I know, yeah.
Yes, I was just about to say I don't think the Devon would be a good idea to start swimming in.
No, you could go surfing in it. The amount of water that's been.
I know, tree trunks coming down it and all sorts.
Yeah.
Terrible.
On what night was the thunder and lightning?
I thought it was Tuesday night. No, because it's Tuesday night because I thought everybody's going to think it's important for schools going back.
But all these people that were saying, "Oh, I couldn't sleep and it was terrible," and I'd actually opened the blinds in the bedroom. I'd gone to bed, opened the blinds so I could watch it because the sky was amazing looking.
I have never seen thunder like that.
That's that. So are we going to hear any outrage about the English exam results?
Well, surely they should all be calling for resignations, and yet somehow I watched a little bit of the no confidence motion of John Swinney. That was horrible. I mean, it was like a personal attack, you know, and some vicious things being said, and
it just makes them look like petty little bullies, and you know, the whole point of having governance is so that they work together to get it right for everybody. Yeah. And more people are seeing that Lib Dems, Labour and Tory are not doing that. Yeah. They just want to be in charge because they just want power, because they want things done the way they want things done. They don't want to listen to people. And for everybody else, much as people were annoyed at the start of it, and I was as well, as an ex-teacher, you're going, people must be pissed off at it's your professional judgment that's been called into question in the first place, and then the disparity between wealthier areas and poorer areas.
I mean, it must be heartbreaking, you know, the ones who are getting 3 A's and university places and then getting D's and things. It's ridiculous.
Terrible. Absolutely terrible.
But yeah, you were hearing tales of kids who'd gone from like 88% in prelims and predicted A's to getting D's.
I know.
Do you know, I would still rather have an education secretary who holds his hands up and says, "We got this wrong, I'm sorry, let's put it right." With that, I think will get them so many positive response, you would think.
I've got this book, Black Box Thinking, and it's all about how you become successful. And it's saying that the companies and people and businesses that are really successful have got there because of all the failures they've made, and they've learned from these failures. And the difference between the aviation and like the medical industry is that in aviation, everyone buys into the reporting near misses and all this kind of stuff, because if something goes wrong in aviation, everybody's at risk. The pilot's at risk. You know, he could be dead too. The doctor's not going to die doing an operation, but a person might die during an operation. And when that happens, they try to say, well, it wasn't our fault, we told you the risks, rather than going, yeah, did something go wrong? Let's look at everything and break it down and see if we can prevent this happening again. So it's a different mindset. There was one hospital I read about in the States where the kind of administrator, when people taking out all the litigation, and he turned around after something had gone horribly wrong and went, "We are so sorry. Yes, it went wrong, and we're looking at it to make sure it doesn't happen again. We're going to learn lessons from this."
The same thing you see happening with that train crash, the derailment this week. And, you know, what on earth was Grant Shapps doing coming up? Transport's devolved. So why on earth he was poking his nose in? But I see the people of Stonehaven, or a couple of shops in Stonehaven, are refusing to stock the Sun. They would, yeah, exactly. Well done, because they've been almost stalking was the word they used. Folk who work on the railway to try and dig dirt on it and try and make it into.
Did you see the headline though? Yeah, Death Express was the headline. It's absolutely obscene.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And they've also had coming alongside those migrants in a dinghy and asking them where they're from. I mean, that is just not journalism. There's a hashtag started trending, "This is not journalism." And it isn't. It is porn. It's awful.
It is. The first time I ever noticed that kind of odd voyeuristic behaviour, it was comic relief. I'll never ever forget it. It was comic relief, and it was Billy Connolly was somewhere in Africa, and they were trying to get money for some clinic for people. People had to walk 50 miles to get to a clinic, and this is the story of this woman, whoever she was, woman with a baby. She walked 50 miles, was dying in the heat to get to this clinic where they were filming. And here she is, she arrived at the clinic, and unfortunately, because the clinic had no money, she died. And it would have cost, now they were filming this woman, it would have cost £5. If you had donated £5, that would have saved that woman's life. And I'm thinking, you're there. Why did you not donate £5? Yeah. Why did you film this woman dying when you're standing there with a fiver in your pocket telling us that we need to give you a fiver?
Mm-hmm.
It's always the kind of rich peoples that, Gary Barlow goes to Kilimanjaro to raise funds. He could just have donated it.
He could have paid his tax.
Yeah.
Aye.
I've actually thought for a long time that we should stop charity. Not because I don't think people need help, but I think it excuses governments from their obligations.
Completely agree. Food banks, the only reason they can get away with universal credit at the level it's at is because they know we will not let people starve in the community. So, and the people who are putting money in are people who may well be on very low incomes themselves, and they're buying it from a shop at full price. So the shop gets its profit and they're giving it to somebody else who needs it, and excusing the government and the shop and everybody else. They can all keep their profits. I completely agree. I think it's obscene.
Well, it's just awful.
One of the reasons that we didn't do a podcast last week was because I was down collecting my mother from where she lives in the northeast of England and bringing her back up here so she could spend a week with me and her grandson, enjoying all that Scotland has to offer. Now, my mother is Scottish. She's from Aberdeen, but she's also 85 years old, a colonel's widow, and reads the Telegraph and watches BBC News. So I'll leave you to guess where her politics might lie. But despite that, obviously, she's my mother and I love her. So we spent most of the week avoiding contentious subjects. But there were a couple of areas where things did pop up, and when it came up naturally in the conversation, it was quite interesting to see what some of her attitudes were and where they might have come from. 4 things in particular that struck me. The first was that she had never heard the First Minister's briefing, and fair enough, she lives in England. But when she listened to the briefing and her only comment was, oh, and apparently everybody else was under lockdown and she went and got her hair professionally cut. Which I thought, well, isn't that interesting? That must have come from the Tory Graph or the BBC, because those are her only 2 sources of news. So that piece of disinformation, which I know was on Twitter, but there's certainly no way my mother goes anywhere near Twitter. So it's interesting that had penetrated her consciousness. So we were able to debunk that one. The second thing was when we were talking about fresh water and how that there is more water in Loch Ness than all the lakes in England combined. And she looked a little surprised at this, so we dragged out the Business for Scotland booklet to prove it, and also said, well, obviously we'll be happy to sell them some water. And her response to this was, well, that's her big problem if she gets her independence. What's she going to do for currency? And I thought, oh, here we go. It's like independence bingo. That seems to be the unionist equivalent of light the blue touch paper and retire. And they think a conversation stopper and it immediately wins them the argument. So, of course, we had a little discussion there. But the other point that I thought was interesting is, I seem to recall this with Salmond as well, is that it's portrayed as a very personal desire from the leaders. This was something that Nicola Sturgeon wanted, and that she had somehow fooled the rest of us into wanting this thing. And in fact, almost as if we didn't really count. It was what she wanted, therefore she was going to get. It was very personalised. Remember that from 2014 as well. It was very much personalised into what Salmond wanted, and so all the attacks became personal attacks against Salmond. So that doesn't seem to have changed at all. And I'm quite encouraged by what a poor job the Telegraph and the BBC are doing of giving my mother, and by extension any other people who consume their product, anything new to go with. Other than the haircut, which is easily debunked, it was currency and a personal attack that independence is somehow to shore up at one individual's ego. So if that's the best they can do, then I think we're home and dry. And then there was one more point when she dropped into the conversation how the EU have been stealing our fish for years. So we weren't letting that one go. So a little bit of discussion about how 40% of English quota has been sold. It's not been stolen, it's been sold by the English fishermen. And luckily at that point we changed the subject and moved on to safer territory. But had the conversation continued, I did have up my sleeve the wonderful clip from Philippa Whitford about the issues with the fishing industry. So just in case we ever need it again, here's Philippa with a fabulous explanation of what the situation is.
One of the other industries in my constituency is fishing, which is always held up as the great beneficiary of Brexit. But in my constituency, the catch is dominated by langoustine and lobster, 85% of which goes to the EU. And every few hours of delay decreases its value. Now, the problem for them is that actually fishermen from Northern Ireland, much as they don't want the benefit, will be able to fish in the same waters and have direct and swift access to the single market through the south of Ireland. They also will not face tariffs on processed fish, which will hit smoked salmon, not just Scotland's biggest food export, but the UK's biggest food export. And we're talking about tariffs that range from 5 to 16%. We lose our advantage over Norwegian salmon. And yet, the real problem of the fishing industry, which is that the vast majority of quota is held tightly by very few companies, will not be fixed by this. In Scotland, 80% of boats share 1% of quota. In England, 77% share 3% of quota, while a handful of firms own the majority. And an additional issue in England is that huge amounts of quota have been sold to Dutch and Spanish companies. That's not Europe doing that. That's not the common fisheries policy. It's because this place has never cared about fishing. Up until now, it was always expendable. But, it's been a very useful ploy.
So that's about it for this week. I'll leave the clips that we've used in this week's podcast in the Clacks Women for Indie playlist on the Indie Live Radio YouTube channel, where you can get all our previous podcasts. And of course, we still have our regular slot on Indie Live Radio at 10 o'clock on Tuesday mornings, repeated at 6 o'clock on Thursdays. And if you'd like to get in touch with us for any reason, or you'd like to join us on podcasts, that would be lovely, or send us contributions to use, tell us what you're doing, especially if you're women for indie groups. It's quite hard to keep up with what other groups are doing, so if anybody is doing anything interesting that you'd like to share with us, or if you'd like us to do any advertising for any events you've got coming up or anything like that, we're happy to do so. You can get in touch with us through our Facebook page, Clackmannanshire Women for Independence, or through our Twitter, which is @ClacksWifey, or you can get us through any of the Indie Live Radio Facebook pages or Twitter. And we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, that's it from us, so bye now.
in the light of